All right, my friends. So Andy, Helena, and I have been with you for a little bit more than 2 weeks. And it has been a pleasure to get to know all of you and to kind of be immersed, even for a short time, within this community. There is something about coming to these islands and being with people that makes a big difference. And we are grateful for your hospitality. We have learned a great deal about the island history. And one of the things I've learned more than anything is I've got a lot to learn. And with each story that I have heard, I am more and more aware of the complicated history here and how there are no easy answers. So one of the things that Andy, Helene, and I were able to do this past week was to fly over to the big island of Hawaii and to stay for 3 days. I don't know if you know this or not, but 16 years ago, this past January 2006, all three of us were on that island for a vacation. Now, Helena had the worst view because I was still pregnant, but she was with us in spirit at that point and definitely bodily presence. And on that vacation, Andy and I decided to elope. So we were married on June 29th, 2006, just north of Hilo. We have not, oh yes, thank you. I love the way that you all clap. That is just the best. So then after that, 6 months later, Helena was born on June 14th, 2006. So if you do some of the math, you will see that when we were there on Tuesday, June 14th, we celebrated Helena's 16th birthday. That deserves applause. Yeah. Now, a part of what we have been doing is we've been doing a lot of reminiscing about that year. When we got over to this big island, we discovered a lot had changed. And we kept looking at each other going, well, of course, 16 years is a long time. Of course, a lot has changed. Now, one of the things that you all should know is that when Helena was born, I had just turned 40 and Andy had turned 55. So we are older parents. And Andy always tells the story of the fact that he can get down with a baby like Helena in those days and play for hours because it's too hard to get up. So if you're gonna get down, you might as well stay and enjoy the company. Do I hear some amens to that? Yes, I'm feeling it too. So the other thing too is he had this master plan, okay? It was a plan where by the time Helena entered puberty, he would enter senility. It was clever. I didn't know where it left me. And I am lucky because Helena has turned to be an amazing woman and Andy is still as sharp as a tack. It didn't work out. But I know, it could have been fun, right? No. But that story points us to a part of what we're talking about today. It's a humorous story, but ageism is a thing, and growing older has its own journey and weights that get heavier and heavier and heavier. As you heard Andy read earlier from Connie Zweig's book, the author of The Inner Work of Age. And by the way, if it's something that this congregation would like, we would be honored to lead a religious education study on this book next fall, because we have gotten a great deal out of it, and maybe this community would as well. The shifting role to soul, shifting from role to soul, is a part of that title. It speaks to the individual and the societal bias to older generations. Zweig is clear that this bias is strong and felt by everyone in some form. One of the ironies that Zweig points out is that it is a bias against a population that we all, or at least most of us, will actually be. The number of adults who are growing older is growing. It is predicted that by 2035, there'll be more older adults than there will be children in our world. This is in Zweig's book. Zweig also points out that it's not just about older adults. There are inequalities against older adults that are intersected with issues of income equality, gender equality, sexual orientation equality, and racial inequality. All of the intersections of these inequalities with the inequality and the ageism is a heavy thing that deserves attention. Older adults have a harder time accessing healthcare, housing, and other general resources for living. And if that inequality is intersected with some of the others that I named, then it even becomes harder. We talk about the climate crisis being a problem for future generations, but it is also a problem for older generations because rising heat, polluted air, and polluted water affects the aging body. So think about it. Unless we die early of one cause or another, we all will age. We will all experience this bias that's embedded in our society. All right, take that. And then, on the other hand, take the words of Adora Svitak. Now, this video was made in 2010. Svitak is now a young adult, a writer, a speaker, and a teacher of many. In 2010, Adora was a writer, a speaker, and a teacher of many. I encourage you to watch that full TED Talk and to follow some of Adora's work. It's amazing. Now, I discovered this particular speech that she did for TED Talk back in 2016 when I started doing some of my research for a thesis. And it led me onto a path to discover the historical and present-day bias against children, which is actually embedded in the bias against women. We see it in our own Unitarian Universalist context. Often religious education is a confusing mixture of education and family ministry. I've often wondered why it is that the care for children, youth, and families is segregated out from the care of the full congregation. We see that even in our own worship. So, for example, we call the story for all ages. Does that mean that the rest of the worship service is not for all ages? Something to think about. We're not going to dive as deep into that now. I just raise these as wonder questions because now the most important thing for us to understand is that ageism is felt in many generations. Dare say all generations feel it in some form or another. The old, the young, and all in between. It is interesting that younger and older generations feel the weight of ageism. And this doesn't stop here. I lift another wonder question. I wonder what it is about our age that causes others to judge and treat us differently than we yearn to be treated. What is it at the heart of the human journey that aging creates a rift? Over the past few months, we have presented opportunities for the First Unitarian Church of Honolulu to talk about what it means to be a multi-generational and an intergenerational community. How is it that the youngest generation, the oldest generation, and all of those generations in between can respect each other and build intentional community? There is work here, and there is work for all generations to understand how we perceive those generations that are not our own. This is not just about the accepting and loving and caring of children and youth. This is the accepting and caring of all generations and understanding that ageism happens all the way across our aging bodies and psyche. So as I invite these communities to do this work and to figure out how it is that we can respect and love each other no matter what our age, I encourage you to use a lens that says, hey, I have needs, and those of other generations have needs. How are we going to listen, reflect, and respect those needs so that we can move to be a better community? And as we do this work about understanding bias against different generations, let us also remember the work that we need to do to build the beloved community. We have work to do to understand and repair our implicit bias and our cultural violence against racial, gender, and sexuality identities. I am a white, cisgendered, middle-aged woman, rounder than most, white hair and wrinkles. And I am ready to engage this work in the community. As a white woman who has benefited in many ways from this white supremacist culture, I am ready to do more heavy lifting. I am sorry to all my siblings of color who have had to do so much physical, mental, emotional work in educating and reminding me and us about the ways in which we need to change. In last week's worship service, I spoke about the need for covenant. This congregation does have covenants. I've been learning more about those this week. And yet covenants need revisiting, particularly in these times of transition. And I would encourage you to add something to your covenants. How is it that you call each other back into covenant in love? Put that in the covenant. Don't just assume that it will happen. Covenants are not a list of do's and don'ts. Covenants are agreements on how we are going to be in relationship with each other. And I'm going to add something. Covenants are about how we are to be in relationship with each other as imperfect humans. This imperfection is an important piece to understand. We're going to make mistakes. Can we humbly listen when somebody experiences harm? Can we find ways to restore? Can we call each other back into covenant and loving ways and grace, knowing that imperfection is a thing? So last April in 2021, I shared a story with you all, and I'm going to end with this story. It is a story that has been a part of my identity as a religious education person, professional, whatever you want to call that, and a preacher since the late 1980s. It's the story of Father Fulham. who is a minister, or at least was in the 1980s, a minister in Darien, Connecticut. Father Fulham was an academic Episcopal priest who was called back into parish ministry. And at that time, he went into the worship service, and everybody in the congregation did what everybody in congregations do when there's a new minister. They're like, oh, we're nervous. Is this going to be a good minister? And Father Fulham got to the pulpit and he preached this most amazing service and on a sermon on love. And everybody went, phew, we got a good one. This is a good minister. And as they filed out, they shook Father Fulham's hand and they said, Father Fulham, that was an amazing worship service. Thank you for your message today. So the next week, Father Fulham came back and he preached the exact same sermon again. Now, everybody was a little perplexed, but they said, you know what, that was a really good sermon, so we could hear it again. And they did the same thing. They filed out and they shook Father Fulham's hand and they said, Father Fulham, thank you for a lovely message. The third week, he came back and he preached that exact same sermon again. Now this time, the deacons in the church were getting a little miffed. So they gathered in a side room to decide who was going to go talk to Father Fulham about this predicament. And they chose one elderly deacon who had been experienced and who was very good at going into these situations. And so he went up and the deacon said, Father Fulham, you have preached that sermon 3 times in a row. And before he could finish, Father Fulham said, that's right. And when you get this one right, we will move on to another. My friends, in that is my philosophy, my pedagogy of what it means to be a religious educator. Yes, there are new things to learn, but the greatest lessons are those ones that take a lifetime to learn. Think about those lessons that we are learning over and over and over again. Think about those lessons where we need to continue to go deeper and deeper and deeper. That is what today's message is about. As we think about ageism and all the other identities who are both bias and persecution, where they have suffered, we have learning to do. So this is a liminal time. This is a time where we can do that learning and relearning and deeper learning. This is a time that you can make covenants to be in community as you learn and grow and discover your future. This can be an exciting time if you so choose. And if you don't choose, that's okay, because you do get to make your choices. Hold your choices close. Be honest about your choices. And know that no matter what, your future has beautiful stepping stones in front of you. Blessed be.